I don't actually know how to pronounce this game's name. Hold on a second.
108の星々が紡ぐタイガー RPG 幻想水湖伝
Oh, okay. So that's an English transliteration of a Japanese transliteration of the title for a 600-year-old Chinese novel. And once it's filtered through my vaguely Appalachian Ohio accent, well, I will most likely be mispronouncing this going forwards, so brace yourselves. Suikoden is a classic JRPG by Konami, debuting on the PS1 in 1995 during that brief golden age where sprite work was in and before full anime graphics became viable and ruined everything. It's got all the conventions of the era, plus a few neat twists that obviously shaped the direction of the sequels and spiraled it into a long-running series, and I would argue more broadly shaped the genre conventions as a whole. I have to make an admission right at the top here. Suikoden 2 is one of my favorite JRPGs. Suikoden 1, well, I didn't think I had ever played it, until 3 hours in when I got stuck on the stupid dice game and realized, wait, no, I've definitely played this, and abandoned it shortly after the first army battle. As far as the series after 2, well, I know I've made an attempt on most of the mainline games, but I've never finished any. The series is very loosely based on a Ming Dynasty novel, Water Margin, pertaining to 108 demons who repent and are reincarnated as mythical heroes rebelling against the government. That number is one of the defining features of the Suikoden series. There are 108 recruitable characters in this game, with around half of those playable in combat, and the remainder in various supporting roles. It's an ambitious and very broad cast, and I'll get more into that later. I'm playing the Suikoden 1 and 2 Remaster that recently came out, which features a few really solid improvements. An auto battle button that just makes every character auto attack, and a 3x speed toggle to ease any grinding or long-winded animations, as well as some more faithful dialogue translations. Some of the graphics are also clearly updated, but I'm not familiar enough with the originals to say if this is an improvement or not. This is going to be a fairly spoiler-heavy review, but hey, this game is 30 years old. We play as Tyr McDall, the son of one of the 5 great generals of the Scarlet Moon Empire, on his first day, meeting the Emperor and beginning his career in the army. While at the same time, his father, Tio, heads north to subdue a rebellion. We're joined initially by a cast of bodyguards, Cleo and Pawn, and servants, Gremio and Ted, who claims to be 300. We're introduced to the Emperor, Barbossa, and his court sorceress, Windy, who rose to prominence because she sorta looks like his deceased wife. The game keeps character advancement very simple. Each character has a single weapon, which can be leveled up by tossing money to a blacksmith, and a relatively simple inventory screen. Not all characters can equip all items, and you pretty much have to manually check what's equipable on a per-character basis. Each can only hold a handful of items at a time, and there's no shared pool to dip into. It's not an issue at first, but once you've got 50 characters, it can become annoying to suss out which character was holding that item you need. Heroes level without much choice, and to accommodate the broadcast, low-level characters catch up really fast. It's actually refreshing on an old game like this to be able to swap in a level 8 character at endgame and have him be up to par in 4 or 5 battles. It really encourages swapping characters around to build your team, to experiment, and the game pretty frequently takes 1 or 2 slots for story-required characters, so they won't inconvenience you too much if you haven't been running with them. There's obvious differences in stats between characters, as well as 3 distinct weapon ranges that determine which enemies they can thwack from where in your formation, but the main tactical considerations are ruins. In this world, the creation myth is that the universal darkness shed a tear, which became the 2 great ruins, Sword and Shield. The 2 fought, and then their bodies became the sky and earth, and the sparks from their battle became the 27 true ruins, which went on to spawn a host of lesser ruins. True ruins are apparently sentient, picking their hosts and imparting incredible magical powers, with long life or potential immortality being a consistent theme there. Several recruitable characters have true ruins, which are typically very powerful, but most characters start with an empty slot. You find orbs throughout the game which activate lesser ruins, ranging from element-themed Vancian magic to straight improvements to move speed, critical rate, and so on. The choices are made somewhat shallow by the difficulty. I'm pretty confident you could beat this game with any combination of characters and ruins, so long as you've got at least one healer or top off on consumables, and keep your gear upgraded. In our brief time in the army, we see the empires slide into tyranny, mostly as a single instance of soldiers shaking down civilians and people griping about taxes. On a mission to clear a bandit nest, we encounter an unconquerable foe, and Ted, activating his secret true ruin, the Soul Eater, easily wipes it out. This causes a bit of hubbub back in the capital. Windy, owner of half of a true ruin, tries to rip the Soul Eater out of Ted, but he escapes and successfully passes it on to the protagonist. Pawn betrays us, alerting the guards to this, and so we become fugitives. It's a short road between being the good boy army brat and leading the rebellion. We flee south, meeting the current leader of the rebellion, Odessa, and her generals, including my favorite dudes, the Bill and Ted of the franchise, Victor and Blue Lightning Flick. We run a handful of errands and then witness Odessa's death. She names us as successor, and then we're off to establish our HQ. We have to pass the aforementioned bullshit dice game, which is actually just a straight comparison of your luck stat versus the NPCs at a time when there's really no way to affect your own stat growth. You have to bet every cent you own, and there's a 1k buy-in minimum. I lost about a dozen times in a row. You really want to save scum this part. After we tough that out, we capture an abandoned tower in a lake, and it becomes the new headquarters of the rebellion. The game opens up a little once we're actually in control of the castle. I'm very fond of RPGs that let me establish a base, then go out into the world and find people or items that can improve that base. And I do generally think that's because of Suikoden 2 that I like that style so much. It starts here though, a little smaller scale, with a nearly empty base, and as we adventure, we start to collect our 108 Stars of Destiny. Blacksmiths, merchants, minigame hosts, spa attendants. As we collect more and more of these characters, our castle visually improves in measurable ways, as well as unlocking more convenience features like an elevator, fast travel, an item stash, that sort of thing. It's sparser than the sequel for sure, but that feeling of improvement and meaningful collection is still here. The plot going forwards from here is pretty simple. It's got some twists and turns, some interesting smaller character arcs when the game locks you into bringing certain party members along, but for the most part we're just directed across a series of occupied areas that we liberate in army battles, often followed by duels. We need to defeat the 5 great generals, including the hero's father, and these battles are handled via a lightweight Dragon Force-style army battle system that essentially boils down to a weighted rock, paper, scissors match. You gain activatable abilities from some optionally recruited characters, which can drastically change the tide of these battles. These are actually pretty nice, giving a little more incentive to hunt down all the characters, but the battles themselves aren't really very difficult, and there isn't any sort of continuity of troops across battles, so they're just a fun throwaway minigame to break up the action. There's also the dueling system, one-on-one story fights that are also just a rock, paper, scissors. Except in these, the opponent will give a dialogue line that hints at their next intended move. These are nice little guessing games. Again, it breaks up the dungeon crawls, which honestly kinda stink. While the game gives us an abundance of characters, the lack of meaningful customization options turns the dungeons into something a little too simple. A surprising amount of the dungeons also don't have boss fights. You're simply killing a string of normal enemies, and then the dungeon just kind of ends. And the boss fights that do exist don't have any special encounter logic like you'd see in contemporaries. This game did release the same year as Chrono Trigger, which handled bosses and dungeons about 100 times better, giving the player something to discover about the big encounters, turning them more into careful puzzles rather than just wailing on an unusually tough enemy with an AoE attack for somewhat longer than normal. There are some sequences that I found interesting, like Necklord's castle, but honestly, the sequel hits mostly the same beats way better. There's a certain rushed feeling to a lot of the plot, a lack of establishing locations, and little build-up for villains before we actually face them. Not enough gravity to the presentation of plot developments, a lot of forced returning back and forth between your castle and the next quest area, that sort of thing. And although I am constantly harping on about how much I prefer games that top out around 20 hours, Suikoden 1 clocks in around 15 and the story feels anemic at times. There are a few good betrayals, redemptions, and surprisingly meaningful deaths, although characters can also simply die forever during the army battles if you misplay your hand. And if you manage to collect all 108 stars and keep everyone alive, well, you can unlock the good ending, where you reverse a single one of the important character deaths. I imagine Flick is watching you reanimate your buddy and really thinking hard about how his soulmate also died just a couple weeks ago. One big thing that Suikoden was doing differently at the time: character-driven political conflict. A lot of the JRPGs that came to America by this point were more straightforward, good versus evil, heroes versus monsters kind of things. Some of them barely had stories even. But perhaps unsurprisingly, given the number of characters, this is a character-driven game. Many of the heroes you recruit were former members of the Imperial Army, who either fell out of favor as the Emperor changed, or abandoned their post when their orders exceeded their morality. Some of the great generals are victims of Wendy's Conqueror Ruin, which gives her some amount of psychic control over them, and after you free them, you're given the option to recruit them. But not all of them. Some of the generals, well, they have their own motivations, and Tyr's dad has to die for the plot. And that's also an interesting statement. Theo McDowell is, by all appearances, an okay father and a good soldier, and yet his conflict with the protagonist, his son, is not resolvable except through a fight to the death. Because those parts of himself, those loyalties, are in conflict. Some parts of the story are a bit unclear, but when you stop and consider things, there are some interesting characters in this game. You probably figured out where the story was going right away, and yes, of course, it culminates with your party fighting King Ghidorah, until he turns back into the Emperor. It's one of the only battles that has a more advanced sort of logic, with each head having a different elemental attack, but it's still not that complicated. I do like the Emperor's death. His last moments, honestly, are really sweet, as he reveals that he's immune to the magical manipulation of the evil court sorceress, and he's actually just genuinely in love with her. His actions aren't related to some evil spell, he's just been humoring a pretty lady. A surprising twist. Overall, playing Suikoden 1 nowadays feels like playing a very normal, good JRPG. There's some really surprisingly nice pixel work animation for small scenes that make the world feel way more lively. That's a huge draw, and the setting has an interesting mix of medieval Europe and Imperial China. Oh, and the music is also definitely above average in this one. Not quite as good as 2, but it's really quite pleasant. Collecting the 108 heroes is fun, and relatively few of them get locked out in annoying ways. But the large cast does feel a little flat, as obviously you can't dig into 100 characters in only 15 hours. But there are standout characters here and there, ones who got a few extra lines and scenes and became really likable. It hasn't withstood the test of time incredibly well, but it is still enjoyable today. On the trusty pain scale, I'd rate Suikoden 1 as a slightly painful. The main reason I decided to play through this is in preparation for replaying 2. There's a ton of recurring characters in the sequel, something I did not know the first time I played it, and importing a save supposedly gives you a bit more dialogue and some extra options, so I'm looking forwards to seeing all of that for the first time. Well, that's all for my 50-second review. I'm planning on hitting a few of my favorite games this year because, well, I'm tired of hyper-realistic graphics, and I guess because I can. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Jotun Warrior, and as always, see ya!